Welcome to Integrated. This is the podcast where we seek to grow in knowledge of God by coming to know ourselves and what we were made for. By bridging the gap between the intellect and the will, we have the capacity to understand our nature and grow as disciples of Christ, surrendering all that we are and all that we have to the truth. My name is Angela Erickson, and today we are going to talk about health. This is really going to be an episode about my health journey, and it actually has a lot to do with some of the reasons why I started the podcast, actually, and why I decided to call it Integrated. To quote something that Melody Lyons just posted recently. If you haven't listened to my interview with her, definitely go check it out. It's on YouTube, and it's definitely on whatever podcast platform you listen to. But she actually posted something about something St. Thomas More said, and he said, "The body and soul are so closely united that together they form one person, and hence a malady of one can sometimes be a malady of both." The reason this is super important is because obviously when we talk about health, I'm not just talking about my physical body, okay? I'm also talking about my mental health, my spiritual health, because there's no doubt, and we see it in scripture too. I mean, Elijah is just a perfect example, and it's so ironic to me, actually. And I'll get more into this, but Elijah in the Old Testament, when he's upset with God, he's crying out and he's wondering why God has him on his mission to proclaim, God's truth. And he gets mad at God and he's angry. And basically an angel comes to him and says, rest and here's some food for you. And after Elijah has rested and eaten his fill, all of a sudden his senses come back to him. He's not feeling like the world is falling down on him and like God has abandoned him. So when I thought about this show and starting Integrated, it really had a lot to do with how we can integrate the body, mind, and soul, because these things they're meant to be integrated. And when our lives are disintegrated, when we have severed these components of ourselves, it's really hard to bring them together without a conscious effort to do so. We have to recognize really what's going on with ourselves. And that takes some self-awareness. It takes a lot of prayer and discernment. So anyway, that's what we're basically talking about, but through the lens of my own health journey. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I would so appreciate it. I've sort of left you guys hanging after my interview with Carrie Gress, and I'm sorry for that. It wasn't intentional. I just had a lot going on, speaking of health, but just my health has been off a little bit the last few weeks. I'm trying to get that back under control in a sense. Have been experiencing a little bit of spiritual warfare, and I was kind of upping my game on some of my my electronic connections, having some mic issues. So anyway, many reasons, but I'm so glad to be back, and thank you for waiting so patiently. If you have any questions, please find me on social media. I would love to connect with you. I love talking to you guys. It honestly is like, it's amazing to me that there are people out there who like what I'm doing. It's kind of a dream come true. I've said it before. I'll just continue to say that because it just honestly blows my mind. So thank you so much. If you haven't already, and maybe you would like to maybe support the work that I'm doing, head over to my Patreon. I'll put a link in the description as well for that. I definitely could use some more support just to offset the cost of putting together this podcast. I really appreciate any support you might be able to provide, even if it's like the cost of a coffee a month, $5 a month or something. I would so appreciate that. Okay. So talking about my health journey, it really begins when I was young. And you'll see some of the threads. I'm trying my best to weave it together. I've recorded this episode several times now, with some success in some points. And then I always go back and I think, gosh, I wish I would have said this. I wanted to talk about this. And so I'm going to try my best to make sure I don't leave anything out. And so to do that, I think I need to talk about the beginning, the very beginning, my childhood a little bit, and then go into my adulthood, because there are so many pieces that need to be woven together to get a full grasp of my story because we're human and our lives are somewhat complicated. But then also, I want to lay the foundation to really give full expression to my home birth story, which is what this is leading into. Because, we just had our first home birth and it was an incredible experience. But I don't think I can fully convey or get you to appreciate how important the home birth was for me. It was a very pivotal moment in my healing journey. And I want you to be able to share in that, and in order to do so, I kind of have to lay the foundation. And two, I want to give some practical tips for anyone who maybe is in a similar place or has experienced similar issues that I have, and maybe doesn't know where to start to reintegrate those parts of the body and the soul that have sort of severed or fractured in certain areas. So I hope to give some of those things as well as we go on this journey together today. So to begin, I grew up just a really typical American experience, especially when it came to health. We ate, my mom, she didn't make a ton of processed stuff. We ate out a fair amount though, I would say. In hindsight, it didn't feel like a lot at the time, but in hindsight, we did eat out a lot. And my mom, she didn't really, we had a lot of fruit in the house, lots of bananas and apples and things like that. But we also ate lots of processed foods like Wheaties and Cheerios for breakfast pretty much every day, or instant oatmeal, things like that, which are just like, they were staples of the American diet. They still kind of are. And, so that's one thing growing up. So that's the kind of the physical component, the dietary component. I've always been a very active person. I loved sports growing up. We went to regular doctor's appointments, got all of our vaccinations, all that stuff. And as I got older too, I sort of realized the mental health component of it. And of course, those teen years are sort of that first jarring moment, I think, for many of us, when our hormones are changing and fluctuating, a lot's going on. But in reality, when I was a child, my parents divorced as a young girl. I believe I was 6 at the time. So it was, there was some real trauma there, having your foundation sort of rocked. And that's why I was so excited to talk to Layla Miller in my episode on adult children of divorce, because there were a lot of things that I experienced as a child that I didn't start to come to terms with until I was much older, and well into marriage even. So all of those things, and there's some really interesting research out there that sort of expresses that, or at least makes the claim that trauma really resides in a physical way within the body. And I hope to do an episode on that. I want to research it a little bit more, but I think it's an intriguing theory that many illnesses, autoimmune issues, things like that, or even physical illnesses, like you can go to a chiropractor for a very long time and you can sort of plateau at the results that you're getting and still need more healing. But sometimes the only way to do that is to go into like emotional release techniques to focus on trauma that might actually physically be stored in the body and release and work on healing those aspects of your healing, more spiritually and mentally than physically. And then you can continue to see more of that physical healing as well. It's really amazing. I've heard about that from, different practitioners that I've worked with in chiropractic care and all that. But there's a lot of research that would suggest that this is actually the case. So hopefully I can do an episode on that someday. I'd love to talk to somebody about that. So if you know anybody, let me know. I would really love to do an episode on that. I have a lot of questions. So growing up, very standard American diet, lots of, athleticism, but definitely some trauma. There was a lot going on there in my childhood, and I won't get into all the details, but there was just a lot there. So getting older, bad high school relationship. My first probably severe bout of depression was probably in high school for much of my high school experience, actually, but I didn't think I realized it at the time. I sort of always thought that I was somewhat immune to that. I had siblings that had struggled with depression, and I sort of thought, well, what they're experiencing is not what I'm experiencing, really. So I must not have depression. I know better now. And at 19, actually, I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism. So, what unfortunately I didn't realize until much later was that it was actually Hashimoto's, which is an autoimmune disease. Sorry, Veronica's hanging out with me today. So what I didn't realize for a long time was that this is actually an autoimmune disease, and there was never a time when a medical professional told me that I could change my lifestyle or my diet or both, and it would really have a positive impact on my autoimmune disease. And in fact, I've heard of people reversing their autoimmune issues, just changing these things. But I remember being told that I would be on a pill for the rest of my life. And I was so heartbroken about that. That might seem kind of silly to many people. It is very much an American thing to have medications. A lot of other countries, it's around the world, it's not as common to be on meds as it is here in the US. It's a big business. Big pharma is big business. So anyway, I remember the first time I took my Synthroid, which is what I take to replace the hormone that my thyroid is not making. And I remember just thinking, oh my gosh, I'm so sad that I'm going to have to do this for the rest of my life every morning. So, but other than that, I was always considered very healthy, even though that impacted pretty much every aspect of my life. I was exhausted. My fingernails and my hair were super frail or falling out, very dry skin, very sensitive to temperatures. It actually explains some of the issues that I have with gaining weight. Like, there's a really common misconception that if you have hypothyroidism, then you struggle to lose weight, or like you fluctuate in weight a lot, or you gain weight. But for me, actually, like 50% of people with hypothyroidism or Hashimoto's, they actually struggle to gain weight, and they tend to be chronically underweight. And I definitely fall into that category. So, and that has contributed a lot over the years to other issues, and I'll talk more about that. I think sort of the most probably most important part of my journey would go into like my fourth pregnancy. I my first four births, I had all of them at home. My pregnancies were relatively uncomplicated. There were things in hindsight, looking back at some of my births, that I have questions about, because I just never felt fully informed about procedures or why certain things were needed. And even if I was in labor, and I might ask a question here and there, it wasn't enough time to process because I'm in labor. You're trying to keep your head in the game mentally to prepare to bring another life into the world. So it was just a different. If I could go back, I would like to think that I would do more research prior to I'm going into the hospital, and just doing more research of my health in general. But when I had my fourth kiddo, his name is Elijah, which goes back to the beginning, why I think this is so ironic, kind of. God has a sense of humor, that's certain. But he was he was my easiest pregnancy, even though he's my fourth. My easiest delivery. It was the first time that I experienced labor, and really the only time when I've experienced labor, like a normal labor, I would say, where my contractions were coming in at the rate that they should be, at the intensity that they should be. In fact, I didn't know how far along I was into my labor when I went to the hospital, because it was so much easier than the other three births prior to him. So I thought maybe I was dilated at like a 4 or 5. And when I got there, I was about to go into transition. I was already dilated to like a 7. So it was wild. I just remember thinking, oh my goodness, is this what a normal labor feels like? I could totally do this. Like, many times over. This is totally doable. It was amazing. And I had him about 3 hours after I first arrived to the hospital. And yeah, it was relatively uneventful. But when I had him, it was COVID. It was 2020. And so, the year 2020, I feel like for a lot of us, we started to look at health differently. We looked at our own health differently. And I had a lot of things kind of happening at the same time. So spiritually, I was in a conflicted place. I've gone through periods of struggling with, I'm just going to be totally transparent. I've struggled with things going on in the church. I've struggled with seeing our spiritual fathers abscond from their duties as fathers and leaving their flocks without our Lord or without access to the sacraments. That really bothered me spiritually. And I can, we always go back to, well, men are imperfect, but that doesn't mean that the church that Christ started is wrong or that the institution is wrong. It's still hard to grapple with that. Sometimes we see a lot of scandal going on and it's scandalizing. So that's one thing I was struggling with. Mentally, I think I was really disturbed by what I was seeing culturally, the way we were divided amongst ourselves, and just the kind of the mania that I was seeing. And I'm thinking of a story. My sister one time went into a Target or something, and she had an asthma attack while she was wearing a mask. And some woman freaked out at her and was screaming at her in the store while she was having an asthma attack. And an associate was grabbing my sister some water. And she happened to be at the store getting the book 1984 because I told her to read it. And my sister, she threw it into the woman's cart and said, "It looks like you need this more than I do," and walked away after she had been struggling to breathe. So really interesting stuff. And so mentally, I just felt somewhat exhausted and confused. Like, why is this happening? Why is the medical field forcing women to wear masks in labor? Why are they recommending masking when there's so much data out there that says that masking in these situations for this period of time with these types of masks, they don't do anything to prevent transmission for a virus like COVID. It just, and then the whole issue with the vaccine. I mean, how are they pushing something out so quickly? There's no research on it. They're pushing it on pregnant women. And so I started to do more research about these things. And I'll be the first to say, like, I was pretty blessed that I had in-laws and members of my family on my husband's side that just, they were already questioning those things. I hadn't. I've always looked at healthcare the same way I would a mechanic. I bring my car to the mechanic and I say, something is wrong with my car. I need you to diagnose this issue and resolve it. And I trust this mechanic to do that with my car because that's his expertise. That's his job. And I have always felt like, well, then I don't need to know necessarily all the things about my car. I can always take it to somebody else and they can look at it. And I've always approached healthcare that way. If something is wrong, I'm gonna try and avoid doing a Google search because I don't want to be a hypochondriac. But I'll go to the doctor and they can see what's going on. They can run some tests and they can tell me how to fix it or what have you. Not really realizing that often fixing it is offering some kind of a pill. We almost never talk about diet or lifestyle changes that could be made. So anyway, but I sort of started to reevaluate all this stuff while I was pregnant with Elijah and went into labor knowing that this was the last hospital birth that I was going to have because I didn't feel comfortable giving money to an institution anymore that I was certain was harming women and children. You can't tell me that making children wear masks for several hours a day is not going to impact their mental health and their cognitive growth and development, their psychological development, all of these things. Our faces are very important for proper development, for learning emotion and how to connect with other people. It was mind-boggling to see people, even people that I would expect to know better, sort of say that these things like the masks weren't a hill that they were going to die on. I'm not like saying this to toot my own horn or anything, but I had a lot of conversations even with priests or friends where this was the hill that I was going to die on, and they didn't see what I was seeing with it. And I think that's because I've loved psychology since I was quite young, mostly because I thought that maybe I'd go into family therapy one day, sort of, I think, as a way to try and come to terms with some of the things in my childhood, you know. But all of these pieces together, I was not in a great place. I mean, aside from having a wonderful pregnancy, then having Elijah, going through 2020, and just the world is kind of imploding. And then Elijah was a very difficult child. He, for the first 6 months, I think we barely slept at all. He was very colicky, especially in the middle of the night. In fact, my husband slept downstairs in our guest bed, in here, actually in my office, but really it's our guest bedroom. He slept in here for, oh man, the first 6 to 9 months of his life because he was not sleeping, and it was taking a toll on his ability to work, and he works with electricity. He's a lineman. So we definitely couldn't let him not get his rest. So Elijah and I struggled with this for the first 6 months or so. And finally, he was diagnosed with oral ties. So if you see me on my social media, I talk a lot about this because it was so eye-opening to me for a lot of reasons. Number one, I didn't know really much about oral ties, but it turns out that all of my kids have oral ties. And so a lot of the struggles that I had with other kids sort of like shifted into focus once I realized that this was the issue with Elijah. This is why he wasn't sleeping. This is why we're struggling to nurse, all these other things. And all of a sudden I could see with all of my other kids what happened. I mean, it was like the light bulb, everything just became very clear. And it was really frustrating because I felt so let down. Like I can't fully explain to you how hurt I was, because there were so many times when I would ask questions and be sort of I don't know, like my concerns were sort of minimized or dismissed. Especially with my oldest, her lip tie is very severe. You can see it when she smiles. I mean, to anyone with even a slightly trained eye, with even the slightest awareness of what this is, what oral ties are for lip tie and tongue tie, it was so plainly obvious. And I was so angry because if I could have had that diagnosis with my first kid, there's so much that happened afterwards that could have been avoided, or I could have been proactive about. I never met any of my nursing goals with my older kids. I was always told that my kids weren't gaining weight fast enough. Nursing was extraordinarily painful, so I was always just told to supplement or to just, no, you don't need to be a superhero. Fed is best. Never mind that those were not my goals, and I never felt supported in my goals. And no one ever told me about some of the things that go along with oral ties and having the whole body, again, this integration. You guys, it's so amazing how our bodies are made. Like, I know we say that, but everything is so intricate, and every system in the body works together to make us a functioning human being. It's absolutely incredible. So while you can have something like oral ties in the mouth, they affect the entire body because it all has to do with this connective tissue in the body called fascia or fascia. Some people say it differently. But this connective tissue throughout the body helps the nervous system send signals to the brain. And the way that it's been described by our craniosacral therapist is kind of like it's almost like a saran wrap in the body. And so if one part gets crumpled up or is tight, it can impact the rest of the system. And this fascia goes all the way from your mouth down to your big toe. And it helps send signals to the brain to help with the nervous system and how we develop, how our brain develops, how we activate the parasympathetic nervous system to calm down after heightened stressor that we've experienced. It's just amazing. So if something is dysregulated or tight within the body or needs to be released, if it's not done, it can impact everything in the body. And that's what we were seeing with Elijah. He was very hypertonic, meaning his muscles were very tight. And I just always assumed that was mostly just from him screaming and crying so much, which it could, I mean, I'm sure that exacerbated the issue, but, he was behind on almost all of his milestones for a very long time. He just wasn't, his brain wasn't developing the way that it was supposed to. And there were things that I was doing that were counterproductive for his development. And again, this is one of those things. I'm not going to say that I think everybody in the medical field is like evil or anything, but there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the medical field is highly incentivized by big pharma. That's just a fact. You follow them, follow the money. It's a fact. Okay. That's why they don't care that they're feeding your newborn formula. They get kickbacks for doing that and for introducing that in the hospital. They get kickbacks for vaccines and things like that. In fact, I remember after one of my pregnancies, after one of my deliveries, I went in for like a follow-up appointment and just to make sure that everything was healed up properly, all that stuff. And my general practitioner conducted an STD test on me without my consent. I had no idea. But was entrusting her to do like a pap or whatever. And she did not a pap smear. I think she was just checking to make sure everything healed properly. Anyway, all of a sudden I get a bill in the mail for a chlamydia test that I never consented to. And when I asked my OB about it, she said, wow, I'm really surprised that, she did that. But because she goes, I would never do that because I know you and I know you don't need that. But doctors are expected to do this on 80% of their patients between this age range. And so she probably just did it to meet her numbers. And I thought, that is super weird. Like, why are you incentivizing or doing this? Like, in my mind, the medical field should be, this is something I need. Can you run this test for me? Like, for example, with my thyroid disease, every time I go to the hospital, or not the hospital, but anytime I go to the clinic or need lab work done, I've had thyroid disease for over a decade. And often I'll have to schedule a full-blown appointment instead of just a lab appointment. And we have to talk about stuff that doesn't matter because it's not a problem. It's they'll check my heart rate. They do all this. They do all the stuff that really isn't that important. They just check my vitals pretty much. And then they'll do the blood work, but then they get more money because they're scheduling me for an entire appointment. All I needed is the blood work done. I don't need you to check my blood pressure. My blood pressure is fine. I could do that at home. I don't need you to check my oxygen levels and my heart rate. I can do that at home. I don't need you to check my temperature. I can do that at home. All I need is the blood work done. But nope, I have to go in for an appointment and do all this stuff, pay more money for that, just so that they will do the blood work and I can figure out if I'm on the correct dosage for my thyroid medication. And I actually said, I just had this done this week. And I told the doctor that I met with, I said, I really don't appreciate feeling like my health is being held hostage. I should be able to come and tell you this is what I need. I've had thyroid disease for over a decade. I should be able to come in here and say, I need labs done. I don't need a full-blown appointment. I just don't. It seems to me very wasteful of time, but also it just feels like you're robbing me and you're forcing me into a position where, now I'm driving a half an hour to an appointment that I don't really need, bringing all of my kids when I could have just had a 15-minute appointment just up the street. It just, these things don't make sense to me. Why is the medical field like this? And so, going back to Elijah, we sort of discovered that he had all these other issues. So we were in therapy for a few months, actually twice a week with him and my oldest daughter, because she has a lot of similar issues that to probably the average person would seem like ADHD or something. She probably would have been diagnosed with something like that if I had taken her to a doctor and had explained more about the symptoms that we were experiencing or what have you. I'm sure that they would have just said, well, maybe she has ADHD. We should try putting her on some sort of meds to help her, chill out a little bit or what have you. And that's just not something that I want to do. I think there's obviously some dysregulation going on. So anyway, with Elijah, we had his ties cut. We did therapy for a long time. But at this time, I was, like I said, not sleeping. And because of that, I wasn't having it was really hard for me to find the energy to nourish myself. I was always focused on the kids, like giving them what they needed, but I also had severe postpartum depression and anxiety, and it would come out often in overstimulation and postpartum rage, which I had never experienced before in my life. So at this time, I was not taking care of myself. I wasn't getting enough sleep. I wasn't nourishing my body. I was losing weight rapidly, and my mental health was just falling apart. There were so many times when I would like hide away for a few minutes and just think about how much I hated my life and how much better I thought maybe the world would be if like I was not in it. Mostly just because I didn't want to be fighting so much every day with just how difficult things were. I never seriously thought about, ending my life, but I mean, I tried to imagine what it would be like if I wasn't there anymore often, or what it would be like if I just, while I was driving one day, if I just kept driving and just to see where I'd end up. Because I just I wanted to feel a sense of freedom from the things that were just holding me so tightly, that had me in the grip, that despair and loneliness and depression, and feeling like I was too tired to do anything. So and I'm really hard on myself. That's just that's something I struggle with. I might be somewhat scrupulous, but I'm much quicker to forgive other people than I am to forgive myself. And so if I feel like I'm not doing enough, I feel like I remind myself of that a lot. It's not very healthy. And it's something that's part of my healing journey right now, is trying to overcome that sense, because what I've realized is that a lot of that comes from a place where I have grown up feeling like I was not worthy of love. I had to prove myself worthy. So I had to do things to earn people's love. And it's taken me being married to my husband for a long time. I mean, it was like 8 years into our marriage before I could really put my finger on what's been going on in my heart for so long. And because I realized for the first time in my life that truly he loved me so unconditionally, and that I didn't have to earn his love. And it took me 8 years of marriage to really see that. And I just felt for the first time that I was in a safe enough place to start tackling that part of my healing. But that's still something I struggle with. It's not, you have to rewrite how you've wired your brain to think for decades. And it's really hard to do that. It takes practice. It's like anything, like any vice. It takes so much practice to rewire the brain and the body to be inclined towards virtue instead of vice. So anyway, this is just where I was at the time. And I remember we were still struggling with Elijah, and I was not open to life at all. And I always felt like whenever my husband and I were coming together, that I was lying with my body. And I remember talking to my priest about it one day, because I wanted reconciliation, but there were things I wasn't sure about. Are they sins? What is this? How do I approach this spiritually? And I remember expressing this fear of mine to him. And it wasn't more than 2 weeks later that I found out I was pregnant with Veronica. And I remember reeling that morning, because I just thought, well, how am I going to do this? I can barely survive right now. And moving forward, we sort of came to terms with that. But I think I spent most of my pregnancy, in the beginning especially, sort of not really acknowledging that I was pregnant, because I was so afraid to be pregnant at that time, and because I needed so much healing. And one day I remember my husband got upset with me one day because I was in the throes of severe depression and anxiety. And so I was really having a hard time getting tasks done around the house that I should have been getting done. And he was working really hard all day. And then he would come home from work and he would start helping with the dishes and doing laundry and helping cook dinner and things like that. And I just felt like the worst wife ever and worst mom ever. And one day he lashed out at me, kind of. I mean, he expressed his frustration. He was very upset, and understandably so. But I was upset too because I just felt like I don't know how to. When you're really in depression, you don't always see it, and it's really hard to explain to somebody um, who isn't or hasn't experienced something like that. It's hard to explain that to them, and it's hard to admit it. So it's not something most people who are depressed are going to go and tell somebody that they're struggling. Um, but all the signs were there, and I sort of felt like, how are you not seeing? I just felt like I wasn't being seen, and I was so lost and lonely in a sense. So that's actually, I think, the only time in my life that I've ever physically yelled at my husband. But mostly because I just said I can't talk about this right now because I was so overcome at that moment with anger and frustration, and embarrassment. I think too, my pride, because he was right that I wasn't getting things done, but he wasn't seeing the why. And he hadn't asked me why. He sort of was resenting how things were going. And instead of asking why, which kind of is one of these areas where I want to, a pointer for anyone who is struggling or their spouse is struggling or someone they love is really struggling. And you see something, and instead of viewing things like, why are they letting me down so much? Or why aren't they doing the things that they're supposed to be doing? How, I would just really encourage you to sort of shift the paradigm a little bit, shift how you approach the situation. And instead of saying, why not? Start asking, how come? Um, you know, approach that person with more of a mind of trying to understand. Because if you can understand where they're coming from or what they have going on, it's going to transform how you view the person and the situation. And it's going to create and cultivate a ground where you guys can come together and seek solutions and support each other in a way that will prime you for success. So after this moment, it's sort of a pivotal moment in my pregnancy with Veronica. We sat down the next day and we had talked about it a little bit. I sent him a long message sort of explaining to him what was going on because, like I said, it's hard to admit when you're struggling. And I just tend to do better if I can write out what I'm thinking because I'm so afraid of saying something wrong and hurting someone's feelings or things like that. So I'll tend to write out what I have going on. And then too, I think it gives somebody else a little bit more time to process. So he had some time to process while he was at work. And then we could come home and have a really good conversation about what was going on. And this is the other thing that I just so am grateful for is after we sort of talked about things, his response was, well, what do you think we need to do to help you get better? Because you need to get better. And I want that for you. And we will figure this out. And I just think that's such a beautiful approach too. I just felt so seen and heard. And like that's a desire that we have within our hearts, right? Like and two, like from a physical component, I mean, you have the emotional, mental piece that's being acknowledged. That's what we want. That's one of the deepest desires of the human heart is to be acknowledged. I felt loved, which is another piece of that, but also that our body responds in kind, right? Like we sense when our bodies sense safety, that's when healing physically and mentally can occur. Like you need to have those things in place. So And we did. We created a plan. So for me, part of that plan was hiring a postpartum doula because I was so afraid of what it was going to be like if we had another very difficult child. Those were, and then we talked about a practical plan. And I looked at new ways to look at how I could nourish my body better, things that were going to help my thyroid and fix some of the things that were going on with the exhaustion, how we were going to tackle some of that stuff, how we could take things off my plate or prioritize and work together so that I could find some time to recuperate. You know, a Saturday morning, I would, you know, have some time without the kids, and he would take over for that time, and I could just be by myself for a while. These were things we talked about, practical things, and making sure that I could go to reconciliation frequently, and going to mass regularly when I could. I mean, again, we're still talking within COVID era, but you know, really meeting each piece of the puzzle, the physical, the nourishment, the mental stuff, getting a break, and the spiritual, making sure that I was going to the sacraments frequently. Those were all things that really sort of moved me along on my healing journey. But I couldn't get there unless we sort of examined it together. So those are a couple of the things that I want to talk about. One, because I think sometimes we just don't know where to look or what to do. So in terms of health stuff and nourishment, I've really sort of adopted a what's called pro-metabolic approach to eating. I'm not doing it perfectly. And in fact, I'm struggling again right now. I'm just going to be totally transparent. I'm struggling again right now being postpartum, just because it's really hard to find time when I live in the kitchen to like make the kids meals and then have time to do all these other things and nourish myself the way that I can tell my body needs. So I'm still working on a strategy. So if I find a good strategy, I will definitely let you know. But focusing on really nutrient dense meals that are full of things that are bioavailable to the body, focusing on not like, you know, less processed, if any processed foods, avoiding seed oils, things that are going to disrupt my thyroid and metabolic state. I really have been focusing on how to support my thyroid because it impacts every function within the body. So that's nutritionally how I focused it, and prioritizing relaxing after I had Veronica. That made a big difference, and having things in place afterwards for support really really eased some of that burden mentally as I prepared to have her at home. But also too, I just hope that if you're struggling or you know somebody who is struggling, that you can find a way to support them and be sincere about it. Like I said, create an environment where instead of attacking the person or being critical, look for ways that you can examine the why. The why and how did somebody get to that place, so that you can hopefully find healing and tackling it from a three-pronged perspective of mental, physical, and spiritual, and not getting so overwhelmed and doing everything perfectly. Some days are just better days than others, and that's a part of life. And I think we have to practice giving ourselves more grace as we go on this healing journey, because like I said, every piece comes together. You can't, if you tackle one area, and for me too, this is another thing that I started with. I started with the physical component, kind of going back to what I talked about, that quote from St. Thomas More at the beginning, really focusing on taking care of my body and treating it as a temple, because it is a temple of the Holy Spirit. And acknowledging that, like, when we take care of our bodies, it's one way we can acknowledge this spiritual truth, is treating our bodies with a degree of reverence and nourishment, because God gave it to us as a gift, and he gave us our bodies for eternity. At the resurrection, our bodies will be reunited with our souls. And I think, you know, keeping that eternal view of health is super important. So starting with the basic, the fundamental aspect, kind of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, starting with the very basic needs met first, so that you're in the place where you can start to address some of these other things, the mental and the physical, because often the mental piece, I'm not saying always, but often the mental component can be addressed in large part by nourishing the body, giving it the proper vitamins and minerals that it needs and the proper nourishment. Like that's a really big part of the puzzle. In fact, I just found it really interesting that research was recently published saying that the SSRIs given for a lot of mental health issues actually don't do anything to restore a chemical imbalance of the brain. In fact, what the research is saying is that things like depression, bipolar disorder, all this stuff, they are not chemical imbalances in the brain. And if you would have said that a decade ago, like, or even longer, like Tom Cruise, for example, he's kind of the one that comes to mind because he was ridiculed relentlessly for saying this a long time ago, many years ago. And now the research is finally coming out and saying, yeah, actually, strangely enough, Tom Cruise was right. But a lot of this stuff, I think, it's okay to have questions about and conversations about, explore. Don't settle for one thing exactly, and find what works for you, but really prioritizing the physical body, only because if you do that, you put your oxygen mask on first, then you can sort of take care of the other stuff, right? So definitely start there, in my opinion, while also creating space for that spiritual aspect. And then the mental stuff may follow. And if it doesn't, then it's okay to start looking at other modes of medicine or therapy. Like I think that's super important. Like, especially if you're somebody who has experienced trauma, like pretty much everybody has, it's okay to seek healing that way as well. And in fact, that might be a part of your immediate healing plan. That's okay. You have to find what works for you. But I would start incrementally and begin with the nourishment and the sleep. And honestly, this is actually a great exercise in virtue, not just because you're treating your body as a temple, but because it requires discipline. I'll just give you an example. I sort of have habituated not eating when I'm hungry because I'm stressed out and because, I'm focused on the kids so much. And then all this other stuff needs to get done. So I sort of am the person that, like, I'll get caught up in this. I think a lot of moms are like this, where you're just trying to get all the things done. You need to get your everything off the checklist, because you're so afraid of falling behind. It gives me so much anxiety if I fall behind on messes. Like if I'm at someone else's house and their house is messy, I really don't care. Like I genuinely don't care. I totally get it. But if it's my own house, it stresses me out because I can see that I have things to do and they're not done yet. So you can see the difference there. And I've really learned that I have to prioritize. Nope, Angela, the house is a mess and you're not going to get to it today the way that you want to. You need to eat. Okay. Or Angela, now is the time, even though you want to go do this thing, you should really take like an Epsom salt bath or something to relax and support your metabolic health. Do things that are going to support you that way, even though I don't want to. Like you would think I like baths, and so maybe I should just want to do it. But sometimes it feels like too much work. And that's another thing is changing that mindset of this feels like too much work. This feels like too much work. But if you habituate something enough and you practice it enough, it becomes part of your nature. It becomes second nature to you. So it feels hard at first. It's those baby steps, starting with those baby steps and making a plan and sticking to it the best that you can, and not beating yourself up if you don't stick to it. Okay. Or if you skip a couple of days, it's okay to go back and circle back and say, all right, I'm recommitting to this. It's kind of like reconciliation, right? Like, I don't know about you, but I go to reconciliation. I confess pretty much the same sins almost every time I go. Do I like it? No. Do I see very clearly my biggest weaknesses? Yes. And so I have an opportunity to recommit myself to addressing and tackling those sins in my life over and over and over again. And I think God, He's not going to shame you for that. I think yes, I mean, there's like a proper balance, right? And this is something else that I really struggle with, is having a proper balance of not being too easy on myself and letting myself off the hook to the point where I don't make any progress, or going to the other end where I cannot forgive myself for certain things, or, you know, not having any grace, treating myself in a way that I would never treat anybody else, right? As if somehow I'm special. Or, you know, there's a component of pride there, right? And vanity, I think. And so trying to find that proper balance, and that's where like a good priest, I think, and having a good prayer life makes such a big difference. And also nourishing your body so that you can see things as they are properly. When you're dysregulated, you have cortisol and adrenaline running through your body. And so everything feels like a more threatening situation than it is. And your frontal lobe can't work. So all of those things, they interplay. And I've just been going through that myself, finding all these different pieces of my life that need healing, setting boundaries where boundaries need to be made. And moving into this pregnancy with Veronica, as I prepare to tell you more about our home birth story, my home birth with her, because I found out I was pregnant when I did, and I was so fearful. And this is the last point I'm going to leave you with. I was so deathly afraid of getting pregnant again. It was, in my mind, the worst thing that could happen at that time in my life. But in hindsight, if I hadn't gotten pregnant when I did, I don't know that I would have tackled the things in my life that needed healing and needed to be addressed with so much tenacity, because I don't think I would have felt such an urgency to do so. I think I would have maybe even just persisted in my depression, or I don't think that my husband and I would have sat down and had that really difficult conversation maybe. You know, there are so many things that I think happened because I was forced into a position where I couldn't run away from them anymore. I had to confront these things in my life, the things that were going on in my heart and my mind and my body. And what I realized is that in that surrender, God used my biggest fear to bring about the most healing in my life. And it's been transformative. Am I perfect? No. Am I still working through a lot of stuff? Oh, yeah. But my perspective has shifted so much. And to God be all the glory, because he just shows me over and over again how he heals me. And he's so gentle in how he leads us. You know, he never forces us, and he leads us so gently. And then when we look back on that journey, it's like you can see how he was lovingly pulling us forward when we thought we couldn't move forward. We couldn't take another step, not even a tiny baby step. And he says, but I've got you. I've totally got you. And in all things, we can do all things in Christ who gives us strength. That means we don't have the strength. He does, though. He has the strength. And so for anyone else who's maybe afraid of what I was afraid of getting pregnant again and bringing another little human into the world, or has healing to do that and they don't know where to start, I just really hope that this episode gives you hope, because I was hopeless a year ago, and God has really changed my life, and he has changed my heart in such a beautiful way. So I hope that this episode brings you, I hope you can share in this. I hope that if you have any questions, you feel comfortable enough to send me a message or an email. Yeah, just super grateful. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Integrated. If you liked it, please hit the like button, share, subscribe, invite your friends, and please consider giving it a review if you have a minute. I would really appreciate it. I'm over on Patreon, so if you want to become a patron and support my work, I would be extremely honored. And I will make sure that there's a link in the description box for you to do so. Thank you so much for listening to Integrated. God bless you.